My name is Margaret Ellsworth, though most people just call me Maggie. I'm 78 years old, and I live in a modest wooden house near Cedar Lake in Minnesota. These days, I spend my time sewing quilts for the church, tending to my lavender garden, and making videos like this one. Videos where I sit down and share my story with whoever might be willing to listen. I don't have a stage or bright lights, just a small table and the truth I've carried for a lifetime. I imagine you sitting across from me, perhaps with a cup of tea, and I talk the way I would to an old friend. I decided to tell my story because for too many years, it stayed locked away in the corners of my memory, like an old box pushed to the back of a closet. I used to think that speaking about it would only open wounds. But age teaches you that silence can be just as heavy, sometimes even heavier than the pain itself. So today, I speak for the girl I used to be. I speak for anyone who has ever been told to keep quiet, for anyone who has felt invisible in their own home. My life has had shadows, but also moments of light so bright they changed everything. And I believe that sharing both, the darkness and the light, might help someone else find their way out. This is not an easy story to tell, but it is mine. And if you are here, listening, then I hope it becomes, in some way, a part of yours too. I grew up in a 2-story brick house on Willow Street in the small town of Haverhill. From the outside, it could have been a photograph in a local calendar. Clean windows, lace curtains, and a garden full of white roses that bloomed faithfully every spring. People who passed by would probably think it was a happy home. They would be wrong. Inside, the air felt different, thick, careful. We moved through the rooms as if we were guests in someone else's house, afraid to leave a trace. My father, Clarence, was a man whose voice filled the space even when he wasn't shouting. He worked at the mill, came home with boots stained in oil and dust, and carried a kind of storm in his eyes. My mother, Ruth, spent her days reading his moods like weather reports, predicting when it might be safe to speak, when it was best to stay silent. I learned early that safety wasn't about locks on the doors, but about avoiding the wrong words, the wrong movements. Sometimes the danger was in the quiet, in the way the evening light turned the living room into a place where no one dared to breathe too loudly. I'd take my school books upstairs and close myself into the narrow closet of my bedroom, sitting with my knees pulled tight, listening. That was the thing about our house. It was never just the moments when my father's voice rose. It was the stillness before and after. That stillness could stretch on for hours, pressing against my chest, making me count the seconds until it broke. I learned the sound of his footsteps on the hallway floorboards, the pause at my doorway, before he decided whether to keep walking. Even as a child, I understood that every step meant something. On the outside, we were the Ellsworths, a respectable family in a respectable neighborhood. Inside, I was a girl counting footsteps, holding her breath, and wondering if this was what all families felt like. If I close my eyes, I can still summon the scent of those evenings. The sharp tang of shoe polish, clinging to my father's boots, mingling with the acrid bite of cheap whiskey. It was the smell of warning. I didn't need to see his face to know what kind of night it would be. Those smells told me before he ever opened his mouth. The house seemed to shrink when he came home in that state. The hallway felt narrower, the kitchen dimmer, as if the walls themselves were bracing for impact. My mother would keep her hands busy, drying the same cup again and again, rearranging cutlery that didn't need rearranging, anything to avoid looking at him directly. I learned that same skill, that quiet choreography of moving without attracting notice. When he poured himself a drink, the clink of the spoon against the glass was never just a sound. It was a signal, a small metallic announcement that the air was about to change. Sometimes it was followed by silence, the kind that made me wish for noise just so I could know where he was, what he was thinking. Other times, it was followed by a sharp comment a question with no safe answer, or an argument that seemed to come out of nowhere. I was 8 when I understood that home was not the safe place my teacher said it should be. I remember sitting in church on Sundays, watching other families fill the pews. Fathers would place a hand on their child's shoulder, and the child would lean in without fear. I tried to imagine what that felt like. At home, touch meant unpredictability. It could be a rough shove past you in the hallway, or a sudden grip on your arm that left your skin tingling long after. The neighbors knew more than they admitted. You could feel it in the way their eyes lingered on our front door, the way conversations would pause when my father walked by. But in our town, people didn't step into another family's business unless they were invited, and no one was ever invited in. There was no one to tell, no words I could use that would make sense to an adult without sounding like I was exaggerating. So I kept the truth folded inside me, a secret I carried the way you carry a fragile glass jar, careful not to drop it, afraid of the mess it might make if it ever broke. School was the only place where I could breathe a little easier, though safe was never the right word. It was more like the danger was muted there, softened by the presence of other people. The wooden desks smelled faintly of pencil shavings and chalk dust. The walls were covered in faded maps and construction paper projects taped up by eager hands. I loved the act of writing, copying words from the blackboard, feeling the scratch of my pencil against the paper. Each word felt like a stepping stone, something that might lead me away from Willow Street. I could lose myself in the rhythm of numbers, the shapes of letters, and for a while, I forgot to listen for footsteps. But even in that refuge, my body stayed on alert. A sudden slam of a locker down the hall could make my hand freeze mid-sentence. If a man's voice rose, whether it was a teacher calling out to a student or the janitor greeting someone, I felt the same rush of heat in my chest, the same tightening in my stomach. My mind would leave the classroom and go back to our hallway at home, to the sound of boots on the floorboards. I sat near the back, not because I disliked learning, but because I wanted to see everyone in the room at once. I needed to know who was behind me, who was moving, who might come too close. While the other children whispered and traded candy under the desks, I stayed quiet, absorbing everything. Teachers noticed my grades before they noticed my silence. I was the girl who always had her homework done, who never caused trouble, who blended into the background like the faded wallpaper in the cafeteria. That invisibility was a kind of shield until one teacher looked a little longer and decided to ask why. I didn't know it then, but the question she would soon ask me would open the first crack in the wall I had built around myself, and through that crack, light would start to seep in. It was the autumn of my 6th grade year when Miss Eleanor Delaney first stepped into my life. She was unlike any teacher I had ever had, tall and graceful, with auburn hair she kept pinned in a loose knot at the back of her head, and a pair of gold-rimmed glasses that slid down her nose whenever she read aloud. She dressed in long skirts and soft cardigans, as if she carried a piece of autumn with her all year round. On the second week of school, she stopped me as the other students rushed out for recess. Her voice was gentle but certain. "Margaret, you're bright," she said, tilting her head slightly as if she were studying a puzzle. "But you walk around as though you're trying not to be seen. Why is that?" No one had ever asked me something like that. Not directly, not without judgment. My instinct was to lower my eyes and shrug. The truth was too heavy to place in someone else's hands. She didn't press me. Instead, she reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a small notebook bound in blue with a thin red ribbon marking the first page. She placed it on my desk. "I'd like you to write in this," she said. "Anything you like. It doesn't have to be schoolwork, just whatever is in your mind. No one will see it unless you want them to." That evening, I carried the notebook home like it was made of glass. I didn't write in it right away. I kept it hidden between my mattress and the wall, taking it out at night just to hold it, to run my fingers over its smooth cover. It felt like a door I wasn't sure I had the courage to open. Miss Delaney never reminded me about it. She simply kept noticing me, how I rarely joined in group projects, how my shoulders stiffened when someone walked too close behind me, how my eyes darted to the door whenever it opened. She didn't look away the way other adults did when they sensed something was wrong. She looked right at me, steady and calm, as though she was willing to wait for however long it took. What I didn't know then was that she was already planning how to help me. She was the first adult to see not just the student in the back row, but the child who was quietly trying to survive. For days, the blue notebook stayed hidden. I would take it out when the house was quiet, running my fingertips along its edges, opening it only to stare at the blank page. It was strange to be given permission to put my thoughts somewhere. Stranger still to know that someone might want to read them without trying to correct or scold me. The first words I wrote were shaky, almost like I was afraid the paper might burn me. I didn't start with the big truths. I began with small things. I wrote about the roses outside our house, about the way their petals looked almost translucent when the afternoon sun hit them. I wrote about my mother humming while she washed dishes, how the humming would stop when she heard the front door open. Little by little, I let more of the shadows in. I wrote about the way the air in the house changed when my father had been drinking, how the silence between his words felt sharper than the words themselves. I wrote about the tightness in my stomach when I heard his boots in the hallway, the way my hands trembled when I tried to stay invisible. Every Friday, I placed the notebook on Miss Delaney's desk before lunch. On Mondays, it would be back in my school bag, sometimes with a small, neat note tucked inside. Her handwriting was steady, slanted just enough to feel personal. The first time she wrote it, I read the words 3 times to be sure I hadn't imagined them. "It's not your fault." That sentence sat in my mind like a stone dropped into a still pond. I had never considered the possibility. For years, I had believed the unspoken rule that if something was wrong, it must be because I had done something to cause it. She never asked for more than I could give. Sometimes her notes were only a few words. "You're strong," or "I'm proud of you." But those few words began to feel like small lights in a very long hallway. Miss Delaney also found ways to keep me at school longer. She would ask if I could help her organize books in the library or grade simple spelling tests. Once, she handed me a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, saying it was a leftover from the teacher's lounge. I didn't realize until much later that she had packed it herself, knowing I sometimes went to bed without dinner. In those months, I began to feel something I hadn't felt in years, a fragile, cautious trust. I didn't yet believe I could be safe. But I was beginning to believe that someone wanted me to be. I was 13 the night the line finally broke. It had been raining hard since late afternoon, the kind of steady, relentless rain that made the whole town feel quieter. My mother and I ate dinner without speaking much. Overcooked potatoes and thin slices of ham that she moved around her plate but didn't finish. I knew she was listening for the sound of his truck in the driveway. So was I. When the door finally opened, the smell of whiskey reached us before he did. His boots left wet prints across the kitchen floor. His eyes were bloodshot, his jaw tight. He mumbled something to my mother and then looked at me in a way that made my chest tighten. I stood up to take my plate to the sink, but before I could get there, his hand clamped around my upper arm. Not hard enough to leave a bruise yet, but hard enough to stop me cold. My mother's voice trembled. "Clarence, let her be." He ignored her. His words were a slurred accusation about something I hadn't done, something about chores, about disrespect. I could smell the sour drink on his breath. I knew better than to argue, but my silence seemed to make him angrier. When my mother reached out to touch his arm, he turned on her, his voice rising, sharp and ugly. I felt the air in the room shift, the way it always did, right before things turned worse. My pulse was pounding. pounding so loud it drowned out his words. And then, without really thinking, I pulled my arm free and ran. I ran through the kitchen, past the living room, out the front door into the rain. My shoes slipped on the wet pavement, but I didn't stop. I didn't even look back. I didn't have a plan, only a destination, Miss Delaney's house. I had never been there before, but I'd seen her get into her car after school, had watched her walk toward the White House with green shutters a few streets over. By the time I reached her porch, my clothes were soaked through. My hair clung to my face, my teeth chattered, but I couldn't feel the cold. Not really. All I felt was the ache in my chest and the desperate hope that she would open the door. When she did, she didn't ask a single question. She just looked at me for a moment, reading something in my eyes, and then she stepped aside to let me in. The next morning, Miss Delaney drove me to school herself. I was wearing a dry dress she had found in her guest room, along with a sweater that smelled faintly of lavender. She didn't press me to talk, just kept her hands steady on the steering wheel, glancing at me now and then as if to remind me I wasn't alone. Instead of sending me to class, she walked me straight to the principal's office. Waiting there was a woman I'd never met before, tall with silver hair pulled into a neat bun and eyes that seemed both kind and unflinching. "I'm Judith Hawthorne," she said, holding out her hand. "I work with Child Protective Services." Her voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent of seriousness that made my stomach twist. I sat down and stared at my hands while she asked questions, simple ones at first. Did I feel safe at home? Did anyone ever hurt me? Did I want to talk about last night? My throat tightened. I glanced at Miss Delaney, who gave me the smallest nod, the kind that says it's all right. So I began to speak. Not everything, not the worst parts, but enough. Enough for Judith to take out a notepad and begin writing. Over the next weeks, Judith visited our house more than once. She spoke with my parents, separately and together. She talked to neighbors, asked my teachers for observations, looked for signs that I had been telling the truth. I could feel the tension building each time she appeared at the door. My father's anger simmered higher with each visit, his silences growing longer and heavier. At school, Judith would meet me in the library or the counselor's office. She explained that they were assessing the situation. I didn't fully understand what that meant, only that something was shifting. I was no longer invisible, and that was both terrifying and strangely comforting. Miss Delaney kept close, finding excuses for me to stay late at school, so I wouldn't have to walk home right away. She and Judith spoke in quiet tones I wasn't meant to overhear, but I caught words like placement, petition, removal. The air at home became more volatile. Even without direct confrontations, I could feel the edges sharpening. It was as if my father sensed that something, or someone, was trying to take control away from him. I didn't know exactly how much time I had before things came to a head. I only knew it was running out. It happened on a Thursday, in the middle of a gray, windless afternoon. I was in the library, helping Miss Delaney stack returned books, when Judith appeared at the doorway. She wasn't alone. 2 uniformed police officers stood behind her. Judith's voice was calm, but her eyes held a gravity that made my chest tighten. "Margaret, we need you to come with us," she said. "We have a court order." The words barely registered. My first instinct was to ask about my mother. My second was to wonder if my father was home. But there was no time for questions. I followed them out of the school, my feet feeling both heavy and unsteady, as though I were walking into a dream I didn't dare believe. When we pulled up to the house on Willow Street, his truck was already in the driveway. My stomach turned. One of the officers went ahead of us, knocking on the door with a firmness that made the frame rattle. My father opened it. His face was flushed, his eyes sharp with suspicion. He took in the sight of Judith, the officers, and then me, standing slightly behind them. His voice was tight. "What's this about?" Judith stepped forward holding a folder. "We have a court order for Margaret's removal from this residence, effective immediately." The air between them felt like it could snap. My father's jaw worked as though he were grinding his teeth. His voice rose. Accusations, denials, words meant to intimidate. I barely heard them. I was staring at my mother, who had appeared in the hallway, her hands gripping the edge of the doorway. She didn't move toward me, but her eyes, wet and tired, met mine for a long, unspoken moment. Then one of the officers said, "Ma'am, please step aside," and Judith guided me out. My father's voice followed us down the steps, sharp and loud, but I didn't turn around. The car door closed, and the sound was final in a way I can't explain. My hands were trembling, my heart beat so fast it made me dizzy. I thought leaving would feel like relief. Instead, it felt like being suspended between two worlds, the one I had known and the one I was about to face. Judith glanced at me in the rearview mirror as we pulled away. "You're safe now," she said. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that word could be real for me. But all I could do was stare at the road ahead and wonder what safe would even look like. The house I was taken to that night belonged to a couple named Margaret and Henry Lawson. They were older, with soft voices and a tidy home that smelled faintly of baking bread. My room had pale yellow walls and a quilt covered in tiny blue flowers. It was the first time I'd ever had a bed all to myself, without wondering if someone might come in uninvited. Still, sleep didn't come easily. For weeks, I kept the lamp on through the night, my body jolting at every creak of the floorboards or distant sound of a door closing. More than once, Mrs. Lawson found me sitting upright in bed at 2 a.m, wide awake. She never scolded me, just brought me a cup of warm milk and sat quietly until my breathing slowed. Judith visited regularly, checking on my progress, asking if I felt comfortable. Miss Delaney sent letters in her careful handwriting, each one folded around a small poem or a line of encouragement. I kept them in a drawer beside my bed, taking them out whenever the fear threatened to swallow me. At school, I began to discover what it was like to focus without the constant hum of dread in the background. I could read a chapter without my eyes darting to the clock every few minutes. I could hear a loud noise without my stomach knotting. It was strange, almost disorienting to feel my body slowly let go of its permanent state of defense. But it wasn't just about feeling safe. It was about figuring out who I was without the constant shadow of my father's temper. I joined the library club, started helping with the school newspaper. I even laughed once in the cafeteria and surprised myself with how foreign the sound felt. Healing didn't happen in a straight line. There were days when a smell, a word, or a certain look from someone would send me spiraling back into the old fear. But there were also days when I realized I had gone hours without thinking about the house on Willow Street. Those days felt like tiny victories. For the first time, I could imagine a future that didn't involve tiptoeing around someone else's rage. I didn't yet know what I wanted to do with my life, but I knew this. I wanted to be the kind of person Miss Delaney had been for me. Someone who noticed, someone who stayed. By the time I graduated high school, the girl who had once hidden in a bedroom closet was gone. I carried her memories, yes, but I had grown into someone who could stand in a crowded room and meet a person's eyes without flinching. I went to college on a scholarship, majoring in social work. At first it felt strange to be on a campus full of people who seemed so certain of their place in the world. I didn't have that certainty, but I had determination. Every lecture about family dynamics, every case study about intervention and support reminded me why I was there. I wasn't just chasing a degree. I was preparing to step into the role that Judith Hawthorne had played for me. It was in my junior year that I met Daniel. He was quiet, steady, and unafraid of silence. Where others rushed to fill every pause, he let space be space. He never asked for details about my past unless I offered them, and when I did, He listened without trying to rewrite the story or fix it. We married 3 years later in a small ceremony by the lake. We built a life together. 2 children, then 4 grandchildren, a home that never had to be tiptoed through. The first time I heard my daughter laugh loudly in the hallway without fear of being told to hush, I realized just how far I had come. For more than 3 decades, I worked in child protective services. I sat across from children whose eyes held the same guarded light mine once did. I learned how to be patient, how to let trust grow in its own time. Sometimes I couldn't change their circumstances right away, but I could be their Miss Delaney, their Judith, the person who saw them, believed them, and stayed until the work was done. When I retired, I thought I was finished telling my story, but then I realized there were still people, young and old, living in silence, thinking no one would understand. That's why I began making these videos, sitting at my kitchen table, speaking into a camera as though it were a friend's face. If even one person hears my story and decides to reach out for help, then every word will have been worth it. I can't erase the house on Willow Street from my past, but I've built something stronger in its place. A home full of love, a career built on protection, and a legacy I hope will last beyond me. If you're listening to me now and you are living in silence, thinking no one sees you, hear this. Someone does. Maybe it's a neighbor who waves every morning, a teacher who notices the shadows in your eyes, a coworker who asks twice how you're doing because the first answer didn't sound true. There are people who will believe you. There are people who will stand beside you even when it costs them something. I know because I found them, because they found me. And if it happened for me, it can happen for you. I won't pretend the road is easy. Leaving what hurts you behind doesn't erase the hurt, but it does give you room to heal, to grow, to build something better. And you deserve that. You deserve safety. You deserve peace. You deserve a life that doesn't require you to measure your worth against someone else's temper. If my story resonates with you, share it. Pass it along to someone who might need the reminder that they're not alone. And if you can, take the next step. Call a friend, a hotline, a support group. There's no shame in saying, I need help. Remember the words Miss Delaney gave me when I was still just a frightened girl with a blue notebook. It's not your fault. It never was, and it never will be.